Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Tina Dev, and I am the National OTL Campaign Director. It is an extreme honor to have all of you here this evening. Thank you so much for joining us, and welcome to the 2011 National Opportunity to Learn Education Summit. This is going to be an exciting, exciting summit, and I'm so glad that you can be here. For those of you that are summit participants, I'm so glad you were able to make it safely. I'm glad that you came. For those of you that are just signed up to be here for the town hall, welcome and thank you for joining us. We hope that this evening proves to be a very memorable one for you and that you leave here having a newfound knowledge of the Opportunity to Learn campaign. We're going to go ahead and get started. We have an exciting night ahead of us. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our moderator for the evening. If you watch CNN, you know him, and he is amazing, and I know you'll feel the same way. So please welcome Mr. Roland Martin.
So how we doing? You took my green sheet. Look at it. Brother had it all set up and you just took it. You just, look at you, just messing things up. I got to introduce the man. I'm sitting there, she just took it. Yeah. I'm certainly glad to be here. Yes, I am a commentator for CNN, but also I'm the host and managing editor of TV1's Washington Watch. And I always say that because TV1 paid me before CNN did. So I always... Plus, TV1 gave me a show before CNN did, so I got to give them props first. So certainly glad to be with you. And for this conversation, education is a huge issue for me. It's one of the things that we focus on all the time on Washington Watch, also on the Tom Joyner Morning Show, where I'm a senior analyst. And so I look forward to having a great dialogue. And let me be clear, we're going to have a dialogue, a conversation. If anybody wants to lecture, you got to go somewhere else. And so we want to have it back and forth. I have no problem if you disagree with each other. Just don't throw a chair at each other. We'll be fine. So it's no problem at all having a little disagreement because that's how we're able to get the best stuff out of each person. But first up, I want to introduce Reverend Dr. Kinnamon. Reverend Dr. Michael Kinnamon is General Secretary of the National Council of the Churches of Christ in the USA. He will open, of course, with a prayer and greet everyone here. So, Doc, step on up. And my wife is an ordained minister, and so in my house we believe in short prayers. God hears all of it. Appreciate it.
Well, my goodness, I'm not here only to do a prayer, though. Welcome to this town hall discussion during which we will explore a very important question: is the opportunity to learn a moral imperative in the United States? My name is Michael Kinnamon. It seems like on this panel your name needs to be Jackson, but in fact I am not Michael Jackson, but Michael Kinnamon, the General Secretary of the National Council. The National Council, through its Committee on Public Education and Literacy, is very pleased to join with the United Church of Christ and the American Federation of Teachers to sponsor this evening's town hall, which of course kicks off the Schott Foundation's Opportunity to Learn Summit. And so I greet you on behalf of the National Council and these other partners, and I want to open with a time of prayer. Holy One, source of wisdom and truth, we give thanks for all your gifts, but on this night we give special thanks for those who teach and those who learn. Kindle in us, we pray, a passion for the welfare of students in the schools of this nation. Guide us as we advocate for education that is marked by justice and care. Fill us with a vision of that day when every child has full opportunity to learn, that day when every child is treated as an infinitely valued child of yours. Amen.
Amen.
The member denominations of the National Council of Churches range, I always get in trouble with this, but from Greek Orthodox to Quakers, from African Methodist Episcopal Church to the American Baptist churches, from the Korean Presbyterians to the UCC. And to let you in on a secret, they don't all agree on everything. But we do stand united, friends, in our commitment to quality public education. Education that is publicly funded, universally available, and publicly accountable. I stress this because religion, including Christianity, has not always been identified with reform of public education. And in saying this, I don't mean to disparage the generations of fine teachers and administrators who have provided quality education through parochial and charter schools, some of them associated with the National Council of Churches. But for the past half century, and especially the past decade, we have spoken out forcefully through the National Council on behalf of expanded opportunity for all children through quality public education. This has included a widely distributed pamphlet entitled 10 Moral Concerns in the No Child Left Behind Act, testimony before the Senate Committee dealing with reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Acts, and especially a pastoral letter on federal policy in public education, which not only got me a phone call from Reverend Jesse Jackson, but also was widely circulated in our churches and led to direct conversation with Secretary Arnie Duncan in the Department of Education. In this and other efforts, the National Council has set forth several principles that, in my judgment, reflect a growing ecumenical consensus about education. I want to name 4 of those very briefly as we begin this evening's program. And I am a preacher, so amens are appropriate. First of all, we at the National Council affirm that each child is unique, with special and sacred gifts to be nurtured. While we favor rigorous educational standards, we oppose standardization, which treats children more as products to be tested and managed than as unique expressions of God with different capacities to learn and different strengths to be discovered and encouraged.
Amen.
Second, we affirm that while each child is unique, all children are precious, which means that an educational system in which some children have access to excellent instruction, while others, often in inner cities or remote rural areas, do not, is simply unacceptable.
Amen.
These first 2 principles, by the way, underscore the moral necessity of quality education for children with disabilities. Each child has particular gifts, and all children are precious. Number 3, we affirm that the goal of education is not simply proficiency in such things as reading and math, important as these are, but nurture of the whole child. Churches, of course, have a vital role in forming children morally and spiritually, but it is not an abdication of that role for us to insist that public education should nurture qualities that enable mature commitment and contribution to society, including artistic sensitivity, personal integrity and compassion, civic awareness, an ability to appreciate diversity, and a thirst for lifelong learning. And number 4, we affirm that education should not be viewed in isolation, but as part of a wider social context. Standards-based reform can be effective only if the government also addresses those conditions that correlate with low student achievement, including poverty, lack of adequate health care, nutrition, and housing, and lack of access to early childhood programs and extracurricular activities. There's much more that needs to be said, of course, and so that's why I look forward to this evening's panel when we will hear much more about this from persons who have thought about it deeply. I look forward to their contributions, and I am delighted that you are here to engage in this significant conversation.
Thank you, sir. All righty. All right, I want to introduce our panel. John H. Jackson. He is the president and CEO of the Schott Foundation for Public Education. I became president and CEO on July 2nd, 2007. So give it up for Dr. Jackson. Reverend Jesse Jackson Sr., founder and president, Rainbow Push Coalition. I'm not reading all this stuff. Reverend Jackson. Surely he knows I'm going to mistake because he couldn't get into Alpha Phi Alpha, so he had to join another fraternity, Omega Psi Phi, but it's all good.
Hey, Phi.
Everybody couldn't get in, I'm sorry.
Absolutely.
But this Dr. Jackson got in.
Absolutely.
That's all I'm saying. Randi Weingarten, president of 1.5 million member American Federation of Teachers. Prerna Lal, did I get it right?
Yeah.
All right, just making sure. She's a law student, George Washington University, co-founder of Dream Activists, a national network of immigrant youth. Reverend Dr. Bernice Powell Jackson, another Jackson on this panel, like a family reunion up here. Pastor of First United Church of Tampa. Imam Abdul, Malik, Mujahid. You gave me a nod like, yeah, that's okay. Is that it?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, all right, just checking. He's an award-winning author as well as producer and currently serves as chairman of the board of trustees for the Parliament of the World's Religions, the premier interfaith organization in the world. So give it up for our panel. I've already changed the format because they had 5 to 7 minutes for each speaker, and I figured y'all be like dozing off after 35 minutes. So I want to just go right to a question to set this all up, because when you hear a moral imperative, that differs depending upon what your moral values are. And so when you hear a moral imperative for education, for opportunity, what does that really mean? A moral imperative for this country? Anybody can jump in. So I don't need to call anybody out. Just jump right in. One of the Jacksons start. Got the Jackson 3 up here.
He's looking at me.
There is a sense in which it must matter to us all. There are those who would make the case a race to the top for those who can run. To me, that's the political. Lift from the bottom is the moral imperative because it includes everybody. And so lifting from the bottom is critical. To put it another way, Roland, there is this biblical story where Nebuchadnezzar reached out to the ghetto and got 3 children who fit certain standards, knowledgeable in science and wisdom and all of that, and who scored high on tests. And he pulled them out of the ghetto and put them on the king's table, the king's diet, and they did very well. We know them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I'm not surprised that they did well under those conditions. I am concerned about those who got left behind and who never got chosen in the first place. And that becomes, Nebuchadnezzar, the political, he got 3 bright kids and gave them the best conditions and did quite well. But what about the rest of them is the moral question.
It's interesting that we're in the Thurgood Marshall Ballroom. I'm born and raised here in Washington, D.C., and I sometimes identify myself as a Brown versus Board of Education baby because I went to the first year of integrated schools in Washington, D.C., because even in the nation's capital, the schools were segregated. And so I think the Brown versus Board of Education decision is is one of those points of intersection between justice and our moral values in this nation. And I think we're at that same kind of point again in a different kind of way. I wrote down, I want to just read this part because I don't want to leave out any of these faiths. Because we use love your neighbor. I'm from the Christian tradition. We use love your neighbor, the commandment to love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus' commandment. We believe in that. But that's not a Christian moral value alone. And so in the Talmud it says, what is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. And the Buddha says, treat not others in ways that you yourself would find hurtful. And in Islam, the Prophet says, not one of you truly believes until you wish for others what you wish for yourself. And Hindu wisdom says, this is the sum of duty. Do not do to others what would cause pain if done to you. And the Taoists say, regard your neighbor's gain as your own gain and your neighbor's loss as your own loss. So this concept of love your neighbor, which means all of the children, is not from one faith tradition. It's ancient wisdom from many faiths and many traditions.
So we in America give lip service to what the Reverend Jacksons have just said. We talk about how there should be educational opportunity for all, but we act as if it's only for some. And so the notion of trying to create a moral obligation, a moral imperative that makes us go deeper for children would be a really good thing. So for example, when I say that, there was a chilling op-ed in this week's New York Times about the effect of choice and what's happened in the Washington, D.C. area. And forget about what its conclusions were. That's not of mind to me. What's of mind to me right now was, here was a parent who was crying out about a situation. And the Twitter and blogosphere and whatever afterwards went right after the parent, not the conclusion, and said, oh no, this is wrong, as opposed to going after the conclusion of saying, it's identifying that in this environment, we are not helping all kids. So when we talk about a moral obligation, then it is about all, not some. And that means figuring out, even in an economic, cataclysmic emergency as we are in most of America, it still means morally to dig deep for all, not some. And I think that if we ended up pushing at this, it would actually force us to come up with interventions that are not the easy way out, that do not simply help some, not help all.
Roland, the way I often talk about it is highlighting the fact that the Creator has placed in each and every person excellence. In fact, it's supported by biological data that says that regardless of race or ethnicity, we're 99.6% the same. In fact, there are more genes to explain the variance in our eye color than our racial or ethnic differences. So if we're 99.6% the same, to the degree that we see any variance in educational performance that's identifiable by race, ethnicity, or gender, it's not the racial or ethnic differences, but the social policies and social practices which lead to those differences. So our moral obligation is to remove those social policies and social practices which are oppressing the excellence in each and every person. And that's the moral obligation that we all have, and that's what makes the opportunity to learn a moral imperative.
A challenge which I see, I was in Chicago's big McCormick Place, and late Senator Simon was speaking. And he says, poverty is a moral issue. I thought he said something profound, and I started clapping, only to see everybody's looking at me, including the senator. The challenge which I see between what you say, the moral understanding a moral obligation and translating into specific action, that's where I think a whole lot of challenges are. Everybody will say amen to our realization that it's a moral obligation. And that's where I think the organizers have their work cut out, that something on which almost everybody agrees upon should look something which is actionable instead of distant truth.
I was asked specifically to address questions and answer questions on the DREAM Act today on this panel, but before that I would like to share a story about a young man called Joaquin Luna. He's 18 years old. Last week he was in the papers. I don't know how many of you have read about his story, but he was a high school student in Texas, a very great student, also a person of faith who believed in God and wanted to become an engineer so that he could help his mom get out of poverty. And he worked really hard, and in his senior year of high school, which is this year, he got into his best suit one night and went to the bathroom and shot himself. He killed himself because he was undocumented, because he could not see a way forward in his life, despite being a great student, despite being a great person, with no criminal history, nothing in his past that was bad. It was just he could not see a way in which he could go to school and work legally in the country to provide for his family and to not be condemned to a lower caste for all his life. So with regards to that, I think that there's a moral imperative to make sure that thousands of other undocumented students in this country, like Joaquin Luna, like myself, don't do the same thing and our lives don't go in vain.
One of the things that's always interesting when we use the phrase, what we should do, we should be thinking about all and not some, is that goes right up against our own personal self-interest.
Right.
I mean, we can sit here and be nice and cute, and we can say how all of this stuff is important, but we can go into community after community across this country, white, black, Hispanic, Asian, Native American, Christian, Muslim, take any religion you want, and folks will say, oh, absolutely, it's educate all children. But when it comes down to the decision that they are going to make, the first thing they say is, the most important thing I care about is this child. And so, how then do you propose getting folks to understand that it is a collective, and then accept that to move down that path, as opposed to my kid, my money, I want the best for them, I really don't give a damn about anybody else?
The moral imperative is the love your neighbor part.
But most people don't even know their own neighbor.
I
most of them won't even speak to their neighbor.
But the common sense reality is, if that other child doesn't do as well as your child, how is your child really going to thrive? How is our society as a whole really going to thrive? Are we really, in essence, saying a certain percentage of our youth are have only the future of prison? Because in the 21st century, if you're not educated, well educated, you don't really have many choices in terms of jobs.
I do believe that that is the choice that many communities have made. Go ahead.
So I think what I've seen is that when communities take steps together, what has to change, and I think John said it as well, there's two things that have to change to go to concrete action. Because I'm about concrete action these days. One is to think about the obstacles to the opportunity to learn and start trying to eliminate those obstacles. And number two is a sense of shared responsibility as opposed to top-down accountability. And let me give you, and then number three is when people start marching down that road together, it creates a confidence and a sharing that more can happen. And I'll give you the example that has just been written about this week, Cincinnati, Ohio. Cincinnati, Ohio has always had a teachers union that's been focused on changing instruction in a positive way. Started with peer review, really started thinking about teacher quality. It's been there for about 20 years. But even with that, there was a lot of discord about what was going on in terms of the schools. And there was a group of people, there were a bunch of charters, lots of kids leaving the public school system for charters because of safety and because parents wanted to make sure their kids were safe. About 10 years ago, there was a group of people in the community under this auspices of Strive. And what they did was they started thinking about wraparound services around schools, embedding schools into communities so schools were not the center of community, but a hub of community, like the old settlement houses, like what churches do. And what has happened fast forward is that 52 of the 100 schools in Cincinnati now have these wraparound services, health, social, after school so that kids are safe and protected, and lots of engagement in terms of project-based learning so that you start creating creativity not only around music and art, but also engineering and robotics. Three things have happened. Cincinnati is one of the only cities in the nation that have made annual yearly progress as that term is defined. Number two, kids are flocking back into the public school system. Number three, the neighborhoods are changing because kids are flocking back. And now number four, this week, there was this big report about how Cincinnati really believes in shared responsibility, not top-down accountability. And there are about 300 different civic associations that are part of this Strive group. Now, if I told that story without saying this is happening in Cincinnati, you would have looked at me and said, that is pie in the sky. Right. So part of the storytelling is that here's a fairly conservative community on the southern side of Cincinnati, the community that John Boehner comes from. This is what they've done.
So then, and this is what always jumps out at me, so what you've described can be considered success, moving forward, progressive thinking, making things happen. So then what is the biggest barrier for other places to say, that works, let's follow that roadmap? I mean, you look at sports, I mean, nobody even heard of the West Coast offense until the 49ers won several Super Bowls, and nearly the entire NFL went to the West Coast offense. In sports, if something works and they win championships, they will convert the entire league. Yet for some reason in education, something works, folks go, we're gonna do something else.
You know, there was a football game a few weeks ago with some poor children who worked for a living, who had good work habits, as Mr. Gingrich would understand, and they were, when LSU played Alabama, these are all poor kids on scholarship with work habits. who had been recruited and coached and disciplined and fed and given equal equipment. And what made it exciting was that you could choose uniform color over skin color and direction over complexion, because the playing field was even. And the rules were public, the goals were clear, the referees were fair, and the scores were transparent. Those rules that have inherent justice in them do not apply beyond the playing field. Some of them will be engaged in March Madness for basketball, but May Sadness at graduation time, because two sets of rules. So part of the moral imperative is fighting for one set of rules. As a matter of public policy, we should be fighting for equal, high-quality public education for all children everywhere. The false choice of good school, bad school, all of them should have in them a swimming pool and a piano. All of them should have music and art. We cannot keep cutting teachers and increasing police, closing schools and building jails, and make sense at the same time. We're not making sense. So our public policy is immoral. We're assuming, the 54 decision assumed the issue was a race divide. It was that. We won the 54 race decision, but we lost at the Rodriguez equal funding decision. And so you live at Marshalltown on the west side, and there's Negro about 20 minutes away. One school is in this zone, one's in the whole. This issue, we cannot give up on the fight for equal, high-quality public education for wherever they are. They're on the one flag to have one protection.
But how do we still deal with that barrier? John, you jump in here, or Doc, where something's working and it's effective, yet there's still resistance to follow the roadmap where it worked. And we see this over and over and over again.
Well, I think as you alluded to, we're self-invested creatures often. And we've got to reframe how we talk about education. Education is more of a common good than it is an individual good. Right. As our country is seeing, no corporation that loses 50% of its product is going to be able to grow. But yet that's what we see in our urban centers across the country. And not only 50% of our product, but 50% of our fastest growing populations. So we've got to reframe it. Education is a common good more than it is an individual good. But also we've got to call out the hypocrisy of those who will say from Congress to the White House, education is a human right and civil right, but yet leave it to states' right to implement it. If it's a human right and it's a civil right, the federal government has an obligation. And I know, like Rev talked about, that in 1973, the Supreme Court said in San Antonio Rodriguez that education was not a federal right. But the Supreme Court was wrong. They've been wrong before. They were wrong in Dred Scott. They were wrong in Plessy v. Ferguson, Bush v. Gore, and they were wrong again. And I think it is going to take us recognizing and saying that Brown v. Board of Education, to stay with your football analogy, was a first down, not a touchdown.
That's right.
And we still have work to do. So rather than saying that it's states' rights time, we've got to say it's opportunity time.
But here's what I find to be interesting when we talk about folks who talk about their states' rights. I've been working with the superintendent of the Houston Independent School District because I went to magnet school there, and that school has been woefully underfunded from even when I was there. That was 84 to 87. And so I've been dealing with him. So they're going through this massive examination of the magnet school program. No rhyme or reason how the schools are funded. Some are getting $300 grand, some are getting $30,000. But what's interesting about it is all of these parents, though, are fighting because they want to keep that magnet school, and what they are demanding is parental involvement in the curriculum. Now, I said, I'm sorry. If you got a communications program and you got a parent who has no clue about communications, there's nothing you need to be talking about when it comes to this curriculum. I'm sorry. This is not the field. So when you talk about the state's issue, though, parents will then say, no, we want parental involvement. And so in Chicago, they might have these councils where they are, in essence, selecting principals and getting rid of principals. And so politically, we might talk about federal and state, But you also have parents who say, my property taxes, my dollars, I want to have my hands in this whole thing as well, when they may not necessarily be the best folks to be determining education policy in a school.
But if you know, I would actually give a lot more credit to parents and teachers in the, let me just say why, in the trenches than the kind of people who are making education policy now, and this is why. And I didn't mean it as an applause line. I meant it as, think about, a survey just was done for the NAACP, parents around the country. And it was very similar to a survey that the Public Agenda had done as well. And what you're seeing in communities is a very interesting and smart ask of the powers that be. And so what they say is, and I'm not going to, as Reverend Johnson didn't read, I'm not going to read except to say what the findings were. That the research found that parents wanted more supports for teachers that would help them improve, and less attention to this notion of just get rid of a couple of teachers and this whole notion of bad teachers. They also found that parents wanted teachers to be measured more by the care and the attention they devoted to kids and less to standardized test scores. They found, this was just, you know, around the country of kids and parents whose kids are at risk. This one was, and you hear it in communities, this one all over, I know New York City, I think in Chicago. They want us, those involved in education, to fix struggling schools rather than close them down, because they see schools as really important in a community. And they believe that schools should have rigorous curriculum for all kids and should have the resources to support that curriculum. Now, the reason I raise this is those are things that we can actually do. And as you said, Roland, we have done these things in different places. The reason, the single biggest issue in American education is that we are woefully inadequate at sustaining what works and scaling it up. And we've always been inadequate at doing that. And I think what happens is because there's not a silver bullet in any of these situations. There's a bunch of things that you have to do together, and it needs to be managed well as well. You need to have people who know what to teach and how to teach. And that takes a bunch of doing, because you can't just plop somebody into a classroom and say, go do it. And there's a continuous improvement process, so you need that. And then the second thing is you need really engaged curriculum. And then the third thing is you need to really help kids who are falling behind. And you need that immediate help. And so those three kind of interventions, they look different in different places. But when parents are engaged in that process, they'll start saying, we need a principal who can help continuously improve teachers. And it creates the confidence in a district, if the teachers and parents are involved, that they will start fighting for the resources and the wherewithal to do it.
But it's also the huge barrier control. I mean, flat out control. When you have mayors who want to run the district, when you have elected school board members, when you have folks who are voting on budgets, there seems to be a constant power grab. And I've seen it, whether it's parents, whether it's administrators, whether it's political folks, whether it's then local, then state, then national, and there's this constant power grab that I think prohibits taking best practices and putting them into play.
I agree with you. I was going to answer your question about the biggest barrier. I live in the state of Florida. The biggest barrier for us is Governor Rick Scott. And I don't think I don't think Florida is the only state in that situation.
So what was
there's a whole thing.
What was the barrier before he was elected?
He really was able to bring together all of the negativity.
I understand. But I'm asking this for a reason. It's not like Florida was a 5-star education system before he got there.
It wasn't.
So what I'm asking is, again, I get Governor Scott. I get governors in other states. But what was the problem before he arrived?
Well, I live in Hillsborough. I work in Hillsborough County. Hillsborough County is Tampa.
Okay.
There are many schools in Tampa where 93, 94, 95% of the children are in the free lunch program. That means almost every child in many schools in Hillsborough County come to school hungry. What does that mean? How does that child learn if they're hungry? And how do they make, if they get free lunch during the week, how do they make it over the weekend? Those are real issues.
I'm glad you brought that up, and I want folks to jump in this, because what happens is, Randy, you talked about it earlier, being able to have the variety of services around it. Jeffrey Canada talks about that in terms of the Harlem Children's Zone. Other places are trying to do that. In Chicago, they were spending millions of dollars sending food literally home. But what happens is, when we talk about education, that becomes a singular topic as opposed to dental care, kids eating. All of a sudden, it becomes so wide where people begin to say, now look, we can't solve all these problems, so we can only focus on educating that child.
You can't educate them if they're hungry.
Right.
And Florida has one of the highest foreclosure rates in the nation. There are many, many children in Florida who either are living in trucks or vans or cars or cheap motels. School buses now stop in front of cheap motels because there's thousands of children who don't have homes. You can't learn in that kind of environment. You can't learn in an environment where children experience violence every day without help.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Ron.
No, you got it.
When we talk about education, we're talking about educating the whole child.
That's right.
Not children with no stomachs or children with no emotions,
That's right.
but the whole child. So you have to bring into play all of those supports that are necessary to educate the child. That's why we have been, with the Opportunity to Learn campaign, we've been talking about a plan where we give every child, each child that is a year or more behind, and every city has a group of children who are a year or more behind in reading and math. But yet we don't know what is the plan to allow them to catch up. But we're saying that for every child that's a year or more behind, let's give them a personal opportunity plan.
All right.
That gives them access to additional academic supports, whether it's tutoring, extended day learning, ELL supports. Let's give access to additional academic support, social support, mentoring. There's clear research that mentoring actually helps. And I'm not talking about volunteer mentoring. As a part of this plan, it should be paid for out of the state and local coffers. And some may say, well, that's too radical, but we pay for probationary officers out of those state and local coffers. So let's invest on the front end, project a lower number incarcerated, and we see the cost savings. So additional academic, social, and finally, to your point, health supports. Let's ensure that for every child that's a year or more behind, that they have eyesight checks, dental checks, and mental health checks. And for those students who are eligible for an opportunity plan, there should be under a different disciplinary code. If it's required to suspend, let's do in-school suspension. If we have to suspend them out of school, suspend them to a mentoring program, a faith-based institution, but somewhere where the educational services, because education is a civil right, so each child deserves that opportunity.
I was at the National Press Club, I guess it was earlier this year, where they released the State of Black Children report. Merritt Wright Edelman, Jeffrey Cannon was there. And they talked about what is going on educationally. That was one of the critical issues. But what was interesting in the report of what they talked about, Dr. Edelman said how a significant number of kids are literally going to kindergarten not knowing 250 words. And so in the conversation that I've had since then, I've moderated a number of educational panels. I asked the question, and people get upset, I said, who is educating that child from 1 to 5? I said, before we get to kindergarten, before we even get to that first kindergarten teacher, you can't, I said, I don't want to hear an administrator, a teacher, I don't want to hear a school board member. I said, who is educating a child from 1 to 5? So if we're talking about making education a moral imperative, what then is the challenge that we also have to look parishioners in their eyes and say, you can't say it's on a teacher when your kid hasn't even gotten to the teacher yet. And what are you going to do between 1 and 5 to make sure that kid gets there? And what Canada said, he said, for a lot of black kids, we got to go back from the moment of conception because even in the womb, they're behind an average white child. And so how do we get that parent to understand you were in this thing with us from the moment your child comes out of that womb to the moment they walk into that classroom, to understand the moral imperative?
It could be an uneducated, unemployed teenage mother who can't transmit that in the first place.
But let's say they're not a teenage mother who had the baby at 14. Let's say they were somebody who had a baby at 25, and they might be a high school graduate, might be a dropout. But let's say it's that, because we still see that as well.
I think we have some anecdotal stories that I think are getting away from your first point. They say, my grandmother last with 13 children, could neither read nor write, never went to school, never had a birth certificate. But she had this idea that education mattered. And so when she would work for the Waldrops, when their children threw away the National Geographic magazine and Science magazine, she'd take them at the garbage can and bring them home. To me, she figured it was good enough for them, good enough for me. And that's why when I left high school, finished high school, she was running around shouting, throwing her head up in there. She had a kind of values thing. I don't want to use that anecdote to get away with what I thought was your first question, this moral one. If slavery would not deny the right to read or write was immoral, and segregation separated unequal, immoral, then the 54 decision was a moral legal decision. We made a structural move up from that to Little Rock Central. Then we made assuming the race was the primary issue, then we lost the 72 decision, the Rodriguez case, so we accept separate unequal education. It has unequal results. That's structural. Now, the children who come from this past week, the data is the unemployment went slightly down in America for blacks and went slightly up. Unemployed parents who are facing foreclosure have different households than those who have the opposite set of conditions. So I want to separate this kind of structural inequality, because the school cannot be the dumping ground for all the maladies of the culture. I'm convinced that I'm on your parent kick. Parents should do, we all get 61, take your child to school, don't meet take. Take your child, meet your child's teachers, exchange home numbers, turn off for 3 hours, turn off TV 3 hours a night, pick a report card every 9 weeks, take your child to religious instruction once a week. That's the parent-teacher motivation piece. But man, the inequality factor of unequal employment for parents and home foreclosure, poverty is becoming a big, big deal.
I know somebody might be saying, and this is the 3rd or 4th time he's come back to the whole point of the parents, and there's a reason why. Because if we are to make the case of a moral imperative, and if we are to make the case that we need to demand a high-quality education, then I think we have to do what you said, and that is every parent has to have the same expectation of a pre-Brown versus Board of Education parent who said, I might have a 1st grade education, but you're behind's going to school, and you are going to learn. The struggle to me seems to be There's a group of folks who are trying to make the argument for a moral imperative, fighting the fight, but you do not necessarily have the same attitude of the people who are the troops. I frankly see you as the generals and the colonels in this battle, but do the troops fully embrace the concept of no matter what happens, you are going to get an education and have that fight in them because you need them enlisted in the battle to make the moral imperative a reality?
But I think that, first of all, I do think that we have to do things to empower parents to become better parents. But I think that that works within that analysis works within a legal construct rather than a moral construct. The moral construct says that there are over 1 million children out there who are in foster care and homeless, that may not have parents. And if it's in a moral imperative, we're accountable for them also. Mm-hmm. The moral analysis doesn't say, the scripture didn't say, did you hold parents accountable? The scripture said, did you feed those who were hungry? Did you put clothes on those who were without? And that's what makes it the moral space. That's why we ask this question.
But you gotta have the people to drive change. I mean, you can go before a city council, you can go before a school district, you can go before a state legislature, and you can go there with 5 people making the case. But when 5,000 show up, it's a whole different conversation. Mm-hmm.
So, I want to lean back into John's point, which is, it is, from a teacher's perspective, we want parent engagement. The more parents are our partners, the better kid is. Because you have that partnership at home, you have that partnership at the school, you have to make, and we
I got tired of y'all calling my parents.
Right.
Man.
Right, and we spent a lot of time.
He didn't have limits on the paddle, y'all did.
And we're still calling you. But take something like the data you just said. Take early childhood education. This is where the rhetoric in the United States doesn't meet the reality. So, yes, let's all assume parents should be engaged. Let's all assume we should ensure that all teachers are great teachers. And, you know, our union has done a whole bunch to really clean up our act on this. But if it is true, as the data dispositively says, that between 1 and 5, a kid's mind is the most nimble. And if kids don't have a print-rich environment at home, if they are homeless, if they're in foster care, we have to find a way to substitute for that. And that means if we do, particularly for at-risk kids, early childhood education starting at 3, 4, 5, we think about when Clinton and all did welfare to work, they thought about parents working, giving parents a voucher for kids being taken care of, but didn't think about how we then make sure that that was not simply custodial, but educational. So the research is clear. There should be a law, something, every state that entitles any child who is below the poverty level at age 3, 4, or 5 to have an early childhood education. And that is something concrete that everyone could buy into. Mm-hmm. The research is there, the return on investment, when you invest the $1 in that, it saves $7 later. This is part of what Opportunity to Learn is about, right, even on this issue. So why doesn't that happen?
And also, I think every church should have an aggressive program from 1 to 3 or 1 to 5, because we have churches who talk about it but don't necessarily do. Imam, you want to jump in? Hold on. Imam wants to jump in to Reverend Jackson.
I'm sorry.
Imam, go ahead.
I'm sorry. You, sir.
Thank you. Talking about 1 to 5, I mean, we talk about parents and teachers' responsibilities, and but children are sort of made to be, there's something in each home, the 19-inch thing in the living room, in the bedroom, or just the main babysitter, which is shaping that media and television, shaping the worldview. And these are very formative time of period in any children's life. And it is giving them ideals and images which sometime or most of the time was unrealistic. It doesn't inspire them that I could achieve something other than whatever they are showing. What they are showing has and remote, every kid knows how to, they are born with remote control, it seems. They watch murders, they watch crimes. So I think while on this panel there are parents, educators, and teachers, I think at least there is one media person here.
Yeah, and I can tell you what I did with my nieces.
Huge responsibility.
I control the remote control.
Of the media to create the ideals and images which inspire those children who are just without parents sitting in front of a TV.
But also I think, look, when you talk about clear and practical things, look, my wife and I do not have biological children, but we've raised 6 of my 9 nieces at different times. And two of my nieces, they're twins, we got them when they were a year and a half old. We had them for about a year. If they came in here with their 2 older sisters, within 30 seconds, I guarantee you, you could say those were the 2 you raised because of what was put into them. Now, the older girls, they were 3 grade levels behind. Then we took them, got them caught up in 1 year because we applied what Reverend said. I don't care what happens. This is how this is going to go down. It was a 24/7 boot camp. If they were in the car longer than 10 minutes, they had to be reading something. Not singing to the music, not watching a DVD. There were books in the car. There were books at home. There was a learning center at home. It was an absolute boot camp. One said, "Uncle Roro, can I watch TV?" I shot her look. She said, "Read a book." The look by itself said something. And so there has to, if we're talking about that moral imperative, there has to be an attitude. Not a single person on here can control what somebody does in their home. And the television cannot come on by itself. And I've even said, if you have to cut the cable off, if it's that bad, cut it off. But you can't complain about the cable and you're paying for it and your kids are watching it.
You know, Roland, I want to go back to Dr. Kinnamon's first statement and your statement about the moral imperative, because you can always be arguing, unless the Lord builds a house or a foundation, that labor in vain. If the 54 decision to make racial segregation illegal met the moral imperative, then the decision for unequal funding did not meet the moral imperative. This is foundational stuff. Let's go a step further. Our present national education policy does not meet the moral imperative. Our present national policy does not meet that. The idea about some can learn and some can't, therefore nurture Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and put them in the charter school and leave the rest of them behind. All children should be chartered and teachers prepared. And Chicago's 16,000 children are homeless. They go from home to 1 million in America homeless children. And if some rises to a given height, there should be a common foundation beneath which no child falls. That would be the moral. We've given up on the moral imperative now for the political expedient imperative. And that's why I got all this corrupt testing processing. You're trying to cherry pick at 11th, 12th grade and not develop at prenatal, Head Start, and daycare. I would argue, and if we did nothing in this session, would agree that our present national standard does not meet the moral imperative, that itself is a moral challenge.
Here's what's amazing when I'm watching, I've watched probably nearly all of the Republican debates. And let me be clear, I absolutely believe Democrats and Republicans have absolutely failed this nation when it comes to education. Let's just be clear. But when you talk about making the moral argument, even when a Governor Rick Perry makes the moral Christian argument about educating illegal immigrants in Texas, his poll numbers drop through the floor he is absolutely attacked, and the only thing anybody else could do if you actually want to win is to take the opposite position that he has on the issue, because you realize that really didn't go too well. In Alabama, I think it was 4 or 5 years ago, Governor Bob Riley tried to change the tax structure in the state. And he actually used Jesus as the model to change it. He said, what would Jesus do? Because in Alabama, I believe they tax folks beginning at $4,600. He said that makes no sense when you were living below the poverty line. When the votes were tallied, it was 65-35 against his proposal. He totally lost all evangelicals, the very folks who put him in office. And so isn't part of this struggle when we talk about the DREAM Act, when we talk about educating legal immigrants, when we talk about that, is that you're making a moral case in terms of where we're going as a country, in terms of what's the right thing to do to educate people, but you literally have half of the nation that says, absolutely not, and we're going to penalize anybody who disagrees with that position.
That's the corrupt body politic. Jesus was a minority, but more on the right. Dr. King was in the minority position, but more on the right. You got to determine at some point, well, the vanity asks the question, is it popular? In politics, ask, will it win? Morality asks, is it right? It may neither be politic nor popular, but if it's not more on the right, it does not meet the moral standard. The Little Rock Nine were in a great minority, but they met the moral standard. We cannot keep trading off the moral standard for the politically expedient one. The abolitionists would have lost. If Lincoln had said, I'm running to free the slaves, he lost the election. I mean, because abolitionists were never a majority position. Pro-slavery was always the majority position. We got to make some decisions here as educators. Shall we go the route of the expedient, corrupted, unworking process, or shall we do that which is morally right? The question you first raised is the standard by which we must either judge or not judge.
And what I find interesting politically, and Prerna, I want you to jump in on this as well as anybody else, is that what's interesting is on that very issue, let's just say of providing tuition to illegal immigrants in Texas. What I found to be interesting is that because it was a Republican governor advocating the position, many Democrats were silent. If the issue was about education and what's morally right, folks should be willing to say, I will stand with you on this issue, but not the other 55. And so isn't that also part of the problem, that there's an unwillingness to say, I'll stand with somebody of another party who is right on that issue, but then they say, you know what, then I'm getting control of my Democratic friends, so I'm going to remain silent.
Correct.
Bernie.
I like to say that, I mean, I agree with you that I think the Democrats and Republicans, the two-party system has failed a lot of undocumented immigrants in this country, and actually just everyone in this country. On one hand, you have Republican candidates for president right now who are advocating the most extreme positions, from deporting us all to putting us in detention centers to not having any sort of immigration reform that makes moral sense. And then we have a Democratic president who has beaten the record for most deportations. Obama has deported 1 million people in 2 years. And that has led to devastation in Latino communities and most immigrant communities of color. And so right now we're being failed by both parties. And I don't think it should be about what political party you belong to, but really your principle. Now, what are your principles? Do you believe in family values? Do you believe that a child should be able to go to school without worrying about where their parent is and worrying about whether they'll come home to an empty home where they won't see their parent ever again and end up in foster care? Because this is actually a reality. They have to worry about whether mothers should worry about their children and whether they will come home. Because I have a mother who is a legal resident of this country while I am undocumented. I don't have papers, and she worries about whether she will ever see me again at every day of her life. So it shouldn't be about politics and politicians. It should be about our principles, and we put our votes where our principles are.
Therefore, occupy.
So
Neither party supported Rosa Parks and Dr. King. Both were immoral. Neither party supported the March on Washington. Neither party supported the march from Selma to Montgomery. Neither party were willing to support free Mandela, which means that we must have a principle higher than corrupt politics if we're going to bring about change.
And one of the things we are trying to get back to is that there's been this terrible polarization that has, for example, divided the labor movement from the civil rights movement. And when we get back and pull ourselves back together, because those are the movements that was the movements at Selma. Those were the movements that was the movements in when Dr. King was assassinated. Those are the movements in the March on Washington. And so that's part of what many of us are trying to get back together to do. But I think we actually also are missing something that happened in the last few months, which is, take Alabama. The worst new law discriminating against Hispanic kids and their parents. And what's happening is a coalition, African Americans, labor movement, our union, others, standing firmly, fighting against it to the point that I think we will get that changed. And now, because of that fight, others coming on board. Look at what happened in Arizona in November. The architect of that terrible law was recalled and defeated. So so in some ways, and that's what the Schott Foundation is doing, that is what Opportunity to Learn is about. It is getting community together, not waiting for the parties, but pushing the parties to do what's right. That's what this movement is.
When President Obama was elected, I wrote a piece for Essence magazine where I said the most important question that has to be answered over the next 4 years is, will his election be a moment or the beginning of a movement? And in many ways, I felt folks were waiting for someone to throw the switch on and say, okay, the movement has started, where others simply were still at the inauguration parade, and it's been going on for them for now 3 years. And so if we're talking about a movement, if we're talking about making this opportunity agenda reality, where do you see it beginning, leading in? Because you talked about what happened in Arizona, you talked about what happened in Alabama. But one of the things that I found to be interesting, and again, I look at what took place with these voter suppression laws across the country, whereas the forces behind it chose one state, successful, and took it to 39 other states. There was a concerted effort, a clear plan of action. And so if we're talking about making this a movement, not a political movement, not a partisan movement, but a prophetic movement, a moral movement, where does that movement begin? Where do folks begin to tap into it to say, I want to be a part of it? Or is it a situation that we're still waiting for somebody else to kickstart and then we'll jump along? Go right ahead.
I think movement has already begun. I think moral-wise of Occupy Wall Street movement is the moral voice. There is no question about it. We are hearing the issues of equity. We are concerned about the equal funding, equal opportunity. That requires a proper attention to the structural systemic problems. And the only voice which is out there is Occupy Wall Street voice. It is being heard, but are we part of it? Are the labor movement more institutionalized, or can it be humble enough to join the little guy who is standing up far louder than you can be heard?
And I'll tell you, I've written about that whole piece, and one of the things that I've said, we're going to questions in about 4 minutes from the audience. One of the things that I've said, though, you're absolutely right, that also what is required, though, of that movement, you've also got to have leadership. You've got to have clear plan of action. I think one of the reasons why a lot of people have not necessarily jumped on, because they're saying, wait a minute, where is that? One of the things I talked about with the Latino marches that took place in spring 2006, massive marches across the country, but marches on a Saturday is one thing, what you do on Monday is another thing. leadership still has to shepherd that. So you can have anger, you can have passion, but it has to be channeled into actually policy changes. And so I think they're still grappling with that piece as well, but there's no doubt it is moving forward.
I'm going to argue that Occupy is a spirit that flows into vacuums. It may manifest itself as Jesus occupying the temple, because they had turned the house of prayer into a den of corruption and blocked the entrance. He occupied it. Occupy may be a voice crying out that raises consciousness, which you can't measure. I talked with some corporate leaders today who want to make a certain merger move, a big multi-billion-dollar move. You know what they said, Roland? They say, if we do this, wonder what Occupy going to do.
All right.
They don't know that the people, it doesn't have a face because it's a spirit. And it can't be tear gassed away, it can't be locked up. It's an idea that finds its way into the crack. Dr. King's last act was to occupy them all and set up Resurrection City. And so it may manifest itself in UC Davis as fighting for lower tuition and student loan debt being reduced. It may manifest itself in Ohio as fighting against workers' protection. In South Africa, it manifests itself marching down there 2 weeks ago on the mining companies of exploitation. So the spirit of Occupy is in motion, and I think it is an irreversible spirit.
I believe so, but also when you talk about the civil rights movement, though, the reality is Urban League had a role, the NAACP, Legal Defense Education Fund had a role, National Congress of Negro Women, SCLC. You had the spirit, you had people moving, you had to have SNCC, but you still had to have leadership that channeled people into action to move them to make things happen as well.
It evolved into that. It was not always there. The Montgomery bus boycott took place outside of any of the established civil rights organizations. But it evolved to the point, in its maturity, it became what you said. So this movement, as we know it now, is a little over 2 months. It is evolving into a force and a spirit that will not be denied.
I would say that, you know, this has been discussed about absence of leadership and whatnot, but I'm thankful the wording which you chose, Reverend. Only you could choose that type of wording, and that's why we honor you and respect you. Hey, when people were opposing Nazis, there were people who were opposing Nazis. I mean, the type of structural determinism which is at this moment in our society, in which we have talked about both parties, there are a lot of voices. Majority is the one side, but it does not translate into action which is in support of the majority. So in France, in Germany, there were people, lots of groups that did not have the leader, but they were eventually successful, because the spirit was there, they were connected with each other. So absence of leadership in a way served as the strength of the popular movement at that time. Eventually, probably leadership will join. Probably there are leaders who are still thinking on the sideline, are they going to be successful? But the people who are making it success, who are making a success story out of their vision and spirit, I think will emerge into some sort of leadership.
John.
So as Reverend outlined, Occupy is a spirit, and when the spirit moves, it reveals things. And the revelation is this 99-1. And the message is, you all, the people, have lost your moral authority, and it's time to reclaim that moral authority. For many years, we've given that moral authority to Democrats and Republicans. But I think the message here is it's time to reclaim that moral authority, recognizing that the 1964 Civil Rights Act didn't happen because of Democrats or Republicans, but because of hundreds and thousands of people marching on Washington in 1963. Brown versus the Board of Education didn't happen because 9 Supreme Court justices said it's time to do it, but because in small hamlets like Clarendon, South Carolina, Wilmington, Delaware, Washington, D.C., nameless and faceless people reclaimed their moral authority, which led to Brown versus the Board of Education. And that's why on each of your seats you have this declaration of opportunity, because this summit is about the people reclaiming their moral authority and holding those elected officials accountable for meeting that moral expectation. And those who are candidates definitely should meet that moral expectation. So we'll talk about it more throughout the summit, but to answer your question, Roland, this is going to begin with the people. The spirit has moved. Now it's time for the people to move.
Randi, then I'm going to the question on the floor.
So one of my favorite quotes is Frederick Douglass saying, "Power does not concede without a struggle."
Yeah.
And a struggle, so none of this is linear. There will be leaders that have and will emerge. This lady to my left is a leader of the DREAM movement. Different issues will have different leaders. What's, in some ways, what we've done is we've copped out by essentially saying that the President of the United States has to be the leader for everything, or a party has to be the leader for everything, as opposed to the people starting to move together on different issues. And I think that Occupy gave a lot of people a sense that, oh, I'm not alone in this. I've heard that many a time where people say, oh, wow, other people believe like I believe. And so it creates a consciousness raising, it creates a spirit, but it is a combination of that which John said, which is a spirit and a concrete agenda mobilized and energized by people.
Which is one of the reasons why I told people, I said, I have no issue with the Tea Party. That's people getting ticked off, rising up. Disagree with a lot of stuff that they say, but when folks rise up and demand change, it works for me. Okay, we're going to go here, then here. Question, if it's a comment and you start giving a sermon, I will cut you off.
Is this on? Okay. I don't want to sound unpatriotic in my question, but all studies show that parental participation is a great help all the way across the board, all the way across the country. But I don't want to sound unpatriotic because I'm a veteran Marine, I'm a present-day firefighter in the city of Buffalo, and a substitute teacher, father of 9, and work hard, believe in education.
Damn, you got your hands full.
And an ex-addict, alcoholic, that education has delivered out of the streets.
Okay.
But now, the 1,000 or 5,000 pound jumbo elephant that's in the room that no one is dealing with, in my opinion, and I don't want to sound unpatriotic.
Just go ahead and say it.
Okay, well, we're dealing with the institutionalized racist system that was not designed to educate everybody. We know this. Now, hard as I work, and my queen wife no longer works, but even when my queen wife was working, but hard as we work, we have 4 children going to 4 different schools, and we start work at 7 and 8 o'clock. We can't get to meet the teachers. I'm not saying that it's everybody else's responsibility, but the truth is the economic condition of this capitalist system forces oppression. It forces this situation. I don't want to sound unpatriotic because you're very respected.
So what's the question?
The question is, and I never thought I'd be in the same room with Dr. Jackson, Reverend Jackson, but Reverend Jackson. I never thought, you know, because I came out of the gutter.
What's your question?
The question is, do we really believe that a system that was set up and designed not to educate can do this? Because the urban cities are just the cash cows for the suburbanites.
All right, let me.
Thank you.
All right,
Okay.
we got it. I understand your point. Our parents had 5 kids at 5 different schools. They still saw teachers. I understand your point. Who wants to answer the question?
Part of what we advocate for is to have every neighborhood have great schools so that parents have a choice of sending their kids to schools that are really close to where they live. And if we could get to a system where you have schools that have feeder patterns, have set apart choice, but if you can get to a system where an elementary school is a couple of blocks away from where someone lives in an urban setting, and has some of these wraparound services, that's going to be a very different conversation. That's a conversation about schools being in the hub of communities. And that's what we have been fighting for. When you have schools, and what the gentleman said, I remember a parent in St. Louis saying something heartbreaking to me, which was, I don't have the money to make sure my kid comes to school and then goes to the doctor. I don't have the transportation. Mm-hmm. And so that's part of this notion of school being in the hub or the center of community, so that there could be that kind of engagement.
100 years ago, Carter G. Woodson wrote a book called The Miseducation of the American Negro. It was 100 years ago. I'm not so sure it's not true now. I'm agreeing with you, my brother. And I'm saying that we have to say, when you have a situation like they have in Ohio, where they want to send more money to the wealthy schools in the suburbs of Cleveland, because they are excellently educating students, which means that there's less money going into Cleveland, we have an obligation, all of us, to say that is morally wrong.
You know, I thought where you were going, Roland, because you're always pretty close to this. That is, if I had to put in two categories, what are the moral imperatives of the system, and where there are the immoralities or the inconsistencies, there are system fights. The school system you are in, then there are personal fights.
Right.
And there's also a cultural crisis that becomes psychological about this. If you're behind, don't just say it's racism, run faster. That's what your option is. If you're behind on the ball field, and don't look to the coach, he can't come on the field.
Right.
Don't look to your friends, they say, man, run. Don't look to the enemy, he's happy. Your only option, if you're behind, is to run faster. That's a cultural challenge. I met with some school superintendents not long ago from South Korea, and their problem was parents demanding the first grade South Koreans learn to speak English. Because they're going to speak in a world where English is a very dominant language. And so that was, the system is unfair because it treats Korean children different than it treats other. And these American Korean children learning to speak English so they'll be bilingual by the time they're in the 5th grade. They'll be speaking English, Spanish, and Korean. Because that's the other side of this question. And I'll go to school. And you roll, we've been to some guys. Mm-hmm. How many of you, you have a basketball team? Stand. All right. You're the captain, my captain, Joe. All right, Joe. How many days a week do y'all practice? 6. What about Sunday? On our own. That sounds like 7. How many hours you practice a day? 3, sometimes 4? Okay. Do you ever have radio in the practice? No, sir. Do you have TV on the practice? Looking like I'm real crazy. No, sir. I said, but can your girlfriend come to practice? No, if a girlfriend can't come to practice, the coach don't allow that. I said, when you're sweating and get tired, can you sit down? I said, no, that's what you're doing. You get real tired. I said, suck it up. I said, wait a minute. You mean 6 days a week? No radio, no TV, no girlfriend, you switch again. I said, suppose you come for the housing project. That don't make no difference. So, now I know why you're the best in the world at that which is your priority. Mm-hmm. That's not a gene issue, that's an agenda issue. Mm-hmm. That's the cultural side.
That's right.
If you're behind, don't explain it, run faster. That's the Benny Mays message, right? That's the flip side, because we can sink in a hole analyzing how deep the hole is. We need a rope, not a shovel, and some determination. That balances off that thing.
And I think to Reverend's point, that's one of the reasons why a lot of people misunderstood Bill Cosby's criticism. Because what he was saying was that was a generation that said, I was not able to, but you have no choice but to get the education. And so you're absolutely right. And so it's a question of expectations, because our 4-year-old nephew, we went to the Houston Texans game, and he got his football signed by a bunch of the players, and one of the coaches, Wade Phillips, said, hey, you can be a player one day. I said, no, hell no, he's going to be an owner. And they all kind of like looked. I'm like, but that's a different expectation.
Right,
Too many of us say, no, he's going to be a player. No, I prefer him to be the owner. All right, question over here.
Yeah, so I want to make one point and then ask a question. So
real quick point, then a question.
One real quick point, just real quick. If you're
Okay.
24 or younger, could you stand up real quick for me?
Say it again.
If you're 24 or younger, could you stand up real quick for me? You're 24 or younger. All right, so the point that I want to make is that, one, we're misrepresented on that panel. That's one. Two, we're talking about moral imperatives, and yet we haven't spoken about youth and student rights. Why hasn't anyone up there talked about youth and student rights? That's critical. Students being in control of decision-making, disciplinary functions, curriculum, so forth and so on. Why haven't any of you spoken to that? That's my question.
I would probably say because folks talked about other stuff. I mean, the reality is,
Can we let the panelists ask the question?
Here. No, hold up. I can put 30 people up here who can talk about 50 things, and somebody might say you missed the 51st thing. And so if you want to make the argument about student and youth rights, in 30 seconds, lay that out. What do you mean?
Well, I just gave you a list. I said students having control over the curriculums, having a say in curriculums and extracurricular activities, having a say in disciplinary functions, and so forth and so on. Those are examples of what I'm talking about.
Gotcha. Well,
and none of that was mentioned.
I'll tell you this here. I got 9 nieces and 4 nephews. They got no say in how I discipline them. But y'all go ahead and you want to answer the question.
So,
Go ahead.
So, look, I think it's great when students have a role in curricular functions. And when I was a school teacher in Crown Heights, I taught a street walk class. And I used to ask my kids at the beginning of the class, I said, we have 10 things, 10 subjects that I can teach. I got 20 ideas. I want you to vote on like 6 of them because I wanted to see that kind of engagement. And I think you're right, sir, that when there's some stake in it and some engagement in it, people are more interested. And that engagement is important. In terms of school climate, that engagement is important. Students' engagement in it is important. But this is the issue. The issue is we still have a responsibility even if somebody wants to opt out. And so we have to figure out how the adults are actually being there in a real way for kids, but at the same time creating climates where kids also feel really safe and feel like they can do whatever they need to do.
Can I say one thing real quick?
Real quick?
Yeah, real quick. And we're talking about the opportunity to learn. It's to me, I don't understand why students having rights as far as the opportunity to learn is not included, why that's not important. Creating a safe zone is based on students having a say in what that safe zone looks like. Nobody mentioned that. That's the point that I'm trying to get at.
I think it's critically important for the very fact that you're here. That's why we wanted to convene this summit, including partners and coalitions from the Young People's Project, Young Student Immigrants Movement, because it's about now putting together those policies and proposals that will elevate the voices of students and concretize those rights. I think you're absolutely right. But over the next couple of days, you will find that in the program and in the sessions, that's exactly what we're here to discuss. So only thing I would say is trust the process, but also I appreciate the fact that you're elevating your voice because that's why we wanted you here.
I did. I tell you, John, I got to go to the next person. I did have a choice when I was a kid while disciplined, belt or switch. Let's go right over here. Question.
Good evening. My name is Marnie Barron. I'm an instructional coach in DC Public Schools and also the founder and president of Soul Tree Education Consulting. Roland, I want to answer your question that you posed to the panel, which was, where does the movement begin? Mm-hmm. And in my opinion, Opportunity to Learn needs to start tackling the corporate agenda. The corporate agenda has huge political influence with redefining education reform in this country. And the point that I'll make is that, for example, organizations such as Students First are setting the political agenda. They absolutely set the agenda in DC Public Schools. At least 11 other states have followed suit. And because they've got so much corporate money behind them, They're lobbying lawmakers across the country. State laws have changed. And again, Opportunity to Learn needs to either partner with these organizations or definitely have some sort of a say-so in driving where those corporate monies are being funneled, because the agenda that's being set right now is definitely failing our students.
All right. Next question.
Hi, my name's Tina. I'm with Youth Organizers United for the Now Generation and Youth on Board. I had 2 quick questions. My first question to the panel was, do you all think we can have quality, equal education in a capitalist society? Because I feel as though poverty is a big reason for unequal education, and to me, capitalism cannot function without poor people. So I just wanted to know what you thought about that. And then secondly, I just wanted you all to talk a little bit about the Department of Education and Race to the Top, because you talked about collectivism, but there is no collectivism in Race to the Top because people have to raise the cap on their charter schools, which take money out of the district. So how is that allowing people to think collectively instead of just their own children?
You know, I will say this here. She mentioned charter schools.
The reason that's a hard question to answer. George Bush came out of private schools. Look at him. And Rick Perry came out of private schools. Can't count to 3. At some point in time, that's why I raised the issue that there are structural maladies and there are personal challenges. And we can learn in any kind of system. You can learn on the communism, you can learn on any kind. Somewhere will kicks in. Mm-hmm. And that's where this inner strength, faith comes in. Because don't explain yourself why you can't make it because you can't. Some of you must say, I am an odds buster and a dream maker. So while we fight this, make the system make sense, those who are behind must make even more sense in their determination. That's where your own dreams fit in the scheme of things. And the best of teachers taught us to be the dream makers. I should never forget, when my family became middle class and moved up to the projects and went to another side of town, Roland. And we went to another side of town. I didn't know, which class to avoid. And so I ended up in Mrs. Shelton's class, about 80 kids in one class, about 5 in the other. And Miss White came and evened the classes up. Because the kids had been the year before, they knew to go to Mr. Burden's class because he was going to drive with them and avoid Miss Shelton. So when she walked in, working very erect, she said, erect, diaphragm. We'd never heard erect or diaphragm. So sit up. Then she started writing these big words on the board. She thought we were in the 8th grade. We were just left the 5th grade. We said 6 and 6. She said, I know what grade this is. This is 6th grade. And these are polysyllabic terms. This is a Roger Thesaurus. This is a dictionary. I can promise you this. I will never teach down to one of you little thugs. I know your parents. Because one of you might run for president or governor one day. I don't want to be embarrassed by you. I will never teach down to you. When I ran in 1984, she had retired. She ran on my ticket and became the first black state rep in the last century. A teacher who would not teach down to us. Because the system was segregated. We had 1 book for every 6 of us. All the white kids had the merry-go-rounds and the slide, but we had none of that. But somehow, we turn minuses into pluses. Don't let anybody tell you can't learn because of the system. It's harder. You got to run faster, but you got good legs, so keep running. Please don't give up.
Over here.
Hi, I'm an education student at American University, and I'm hoping to teach the high school level, but I'm looking at
You're going to teach at the high school level?
Mm-hmm.
You'd be like that teacher right there. Sit up!
And I'm looking at the education system right now, and I'm looking at a situation where almost half of teachers are leaving within 5 years. And I'm looking at this, and I'm wondering what I'm getting myself into. And I've wanted...
Hell, come to journalism.
I wanted to be a teacher since I was in 2nd grade, and I guess this question is mostly for Ms. Weingarten, but what can we do to make it seem that teaching is a moral imperative?
Good question. Well, the first thing is the demagoguery about teachers has to stop. That's right. And part of us doing all of this together is we have to recreate that movement of parents and teachers together. a movement that a bunch of people have tried to divide. One of the things that was said earlier by this Reverend Dr. Johnson is about Jackson, I'm sorry, about Rick Scott. People like Governor Kasich, Governor Christie, Governor Scott, the people who have actually been supported by that ALEC group who was behind a lot of the voter suppression work. Part of their playbook is to divide. And to say, when someone like you, sir, says, what about this? They say, well, that's good. Not everyone should teach. As opposed to, we're losing a lot of experience and knowledge, and if we could create conditions so that teachers could actually succeed at their craft, they would stay, like in Finland, where there is basically 1% attrition rate, a country that outcompetes us in terms of education. So one of the keys is that we need to be in a coalition together with others who believe in quality public education, who believe in public accountability, who believe in equity for all children. Because if we have that, then we are walking shoulder to shoulder to ensure that teachers are respected and have the conditions they need so that kids can learn.
But also, I think on that point, Randy, I think we also have to be honest. Look, I have 4 siblings. All of them are teachers. I'm a firm in journalism. There are people who are very good in this craft, and I say you're good. There's some people who suck. I say you need to get out of the business.
Right.
What often happens is we don't want to have some really honest conversations, because I believe that if you're a teacher and there are some bad teachers, you should be the first one to say they need to go.
But
because
Roland,
they're making it bad on us.
But Roland,
And I go after the principals too now. I just believe that, look, you want the best of the best. And if there are people around who are dragging us down, I don't want a bad person in the classroom. I don't want a bad administrator, but I will also, in a minute, praise that person who is handling their business and who is successful just by being honest about it.
So let me just take that on for a second, because our union, over the course of the last year and a half, have looked at that straight directly in the eyes and said, we're going to reform tenure to ensure that it is only about due process, that it is no longer excuse for managers not to manage or a cloak of incompetence. And we have actually took that on. We've changed policy. We have worked with people to change contracts to do all of that stuff. And we get no credit for it because people would rather keep us in the box of saying you're about bad teachers, as opposed to actually trying to do the work to give teachers the tools and conditions they need. We should not have bad teachers, but most teachers actually want to do a good job, and they need tools and conditions to do that.
But the people who want to keep you in the box are the ones who don't want a union anyway. So that's just the reality. Right. Question.
Buenas noches. My name is Agustin de la Gente. I would like to start off by saying that no human being is illegal, and we must not occupy but decolonize. And when you take a certain stand with a certain language, we carry a certain analysis of the system. Now, what do you think are the challenges that we must break to build the educational justice movement that creates a common analysis to build common strategies?
I think one of the things we have to, and it's connected to the previous question around, can we have a productive educational system within a capitalistic system? First, I would argue that we don't have a capitalistic system today. We have extreme greed. It goes beyond capitalism. It's extreme greed. Because there are systems of capitalism where the educational system is more effective. Now, within the US, you put on top of that greed the issue of race, which we have to begin to address. And I think that those are the intersections of dealing with the economic disparities that exist, with the racial and ethnic disparities, are right at the point where we need to coalesce and begin our movement. It can happen. So the question of whether it can happen. Following the implementation of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the implementation of ESEA as an anti-poverty act in 1965, If you look at the data from the mid-70s to the early 80s, the achievement gap began to close. Something happened in the early 1980s that changed it. The election of Ronald Reagan and a change on the enforcement of civil rights. I didn't make this up. Go look at the laws. It was a shift. And we began to see the achievement gap open again. So if there's anything that we're seeing right now, we're back at the intersection of having to address the issue of economic empowerment and racial justice. And that's why in that declaration, we not only talk about education, but we also talk about fair tax laws and the need to have fair tax laws on those who are wealthy. And those are the pieces that we have to begin to coalesce to ensure that all students have an opportunity to learn.
Go ahead, Doc.
There's one additional thing, and it's important for me to say this while I'm on the stage with Jesse Jackson. In 1984, I was very privileged to be one of those tens of thousands of Americans who worked to elect Jesse Jackson as President of the United States. And one of the reasons why I did, and many of us did, was he was the first person who really said, we cannot just stay in our little silos as African Americans or Latino Americans or Asian Americans or rural Americans or whatever we are. We have to come together for the good of our whole nation. And that's what we've got to do again. We still haven't done it. And that's what we've got to do again.
Question.
Roland.
Yes.
Where I think he's also going is that Lyndon Johnson took us from 30% poverty down to 12%, got sidetracked on that war in Vietnam. But today, prenatal care, Head Start, daycare, Child Nutrition Act, Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, Open Housing Act, Medicare, Medicaid, Job Corps. The most productive president in American history, Lyndon B. Johnson, except Lincoln. They're way up there by themselves. There's not been a commitment since dealing with the hull of the ship. Everybody else is trying to shuffle chairs on the deck. We got to again address the impact of poverty upon mindset, ambitions, and life options. Poverty matters. Today, with 53 million Americans food insecure, and 50 million in poverty, and those numbers are growing, and 44 million on food stamps, and 25 million looking for a job, and record-breaking home foreclosures. There is a depressing crisis in the house and neighborhood. And I met the night that Jennifer Hudson's mother and brother were killed, and we were out in the middle of the street praying, and this little gang bangers came, and one said, Reverend, I want to get well. He started crying. They closed the detox centers. And two of the kids said, Reverend, like, we just got the job. We can't get a job. We can't get the job. And as they embraced him, I know if they go down to Inglewood High for a week, they get 10 meals. Go to Cook County Jail, they get 21 meals. For those kids, jail becomes a hotel or a homeless shelter. That is a predicament that's far too many children face.
And to the whole point about politics, I mean, when the president gave a State of the Union address, I took him to task for not even using the word poor. He was the first president in several presidencies not to use it. But here's what was interesting. A ton of his supporters, a lot of them black, were mad as hell at me because I took him to task. But then the same thing, when you don't hear poor even come up in most of these Republican debates, I've said to churches, the synagogues, take your pick, whatever, temples, I don't care. When are you willing to challenge your social conservatives, your evangelicals, to say, if you want them to talk about tax policy, when are you going to have them talk about the issue of the poor? And Ralph Reed had his Faith and Freedom, whatever coalition, whatever they call it. I was tracking the whole thing on Twitter. Poverty never came up. That's why I believe, forget the partisan point, challenge them to say, if we celebrate the same Jesus, the same God, whatever you want to call it, well then I'm going to hold you to account when it comes to your politicians. Question.
Hi, I'm Lisa Fari. I'm a 30-year veteran of the teaching profession and with Montgomery County Public Schools.
Third year?
30 years.
Don't go nowhere.
I'm not. No, I'm not. And actually, I was a member of a corps of consulting teachers who helped keep people in the profession in the first 5 years. But my point, poverty does matter, and I'd like to have the nerve to say that I'd rather see this say national opportunity to thrive for children, because we all know and respect the idea that all children should learn. That's been my obligation, and the expectations have been high for every child that's ever walked across the threshold of my door. But do we really fund their opportunity to thrive in this country? I don't think so. And I think that your point, Ms. Weingarten, about taking to take things to scale. If we could take what happened in Cincinnati to scale, if we all could commit to that today, everybody in this room, that would be a practical way that we could make a huge difference. So I'd like to know your thoughts on how we can either politically or through churches or through broader, bolder approach and their practices take the wraparound services model to scale, especially for children 0 to 5.
Look, I think what the Schott Foundation is doing, what John, what this whole several days are about, is to create a common agenda that we can all rally around. And if you look at the declaration, it has some of the things I talked about embedded within them. I like using very concrete examples that people can get their arms around, because it is something to say, even in this capitalist society, even in this extreme greed society, there are things that are working, and if we see it and touch it and feel it, we can go for it, and we can go for it for all kids, not just some kids. But I have seen across the nation districts that are improving even in this terrible economic situation. And so that's what I think, but what they do is they take away these obstacles against learning. And let me just say thank you for all of your work for all of these years for the children of the United States. Thank you.
Got time for 2 questions, one on this side, one on this side. So what's your question?
Well, first I would like to thank the panel for all the wonderful remarks that you've made, and I'd probably be happy to second all of them except for the one misguided remark about bad teachers.
It's some bad teachers, let's just be honest. It's some bad journalists. I just cut to the chase, Doc. Go right ahead.
Well, I'll talk to you more about that afterwards. I'd like to add to the national, well, anyway, I'm a retired math teacher, and we're quite concerned that students are showing up in college knowing less arithmetic and less algebra 1 than they did 20 years ago. And it's not an accident. And we need the opportunity for students to learn arithmetic without calculators. Right? In spite of the fact that the colleges of education have said a neat way to level the playing field between children who have difficulty learning arithmetic with those who don't is to give all the students calculators. And the federal government over the past 20 years has highly financed programs which use calculators. So I would suggest that you add the opportunity to learn arithmetic without calculators.
So the question I asked real quick is, how do you confront technology helping in the classroom when some might can say technology hinders?
I thought it was interesting, the story that was in the news this past week about the Google educators who send their children to a school out on the West Coast that doesn't have computers in the elementary grades. I thought that was interesting. Obviously, you need both. I mean, you need both. And this is the 21st century, so you need both. But you're absolutely right. Kids need to know how to do math without calculators, but kids also need access to computers and calculators.
I got a 4-year-old nephew, and he is a master doing his math skills, and he's 4 years old on an iPad. So he's doing quizzes and things like that. So I think it's a balance. Last question.
But isn't also a problem where many of us have these? I used to have about in my head about 30 telephone numbers. Now this memory chip I got, I got about 3.
Don't know anymore.
And one of them is my house. I mean, I think it's important is that there's a certain dulling down.
No, you're right.
Of consciousness because you don't have to think, you don't think.
I learned my grandmother's phone number at 9 years old. She died. I still know her phone number right now and haven't called it. It's still stuck in my head.
It matters.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, last question.
Yes, hi, Roland. First, I want to say that comment you made about controlling the TV, I want to say I have a 3-year-old, and I do control what she watches, because I started letting her watch 30 minutes a day of PBS, and instead of saying, "Good morning, Mom," she wanted to ask for Big Bird. So we cut the TV out to only on Saturdays. So now she's back reading books. She's now reading books and knowing how to count to 20. My name is Michelle Williams. I'm a former elementary school teacher in California, and I'm a professor at Michigan State University in science and technology. Actually, I do a lot of work in schools in STEM education around science and technology. And I work in underserved communities as well as suburban. But anyway, one of my questions, I teach teachers at MSU in science ed, and I have a question about how can we as a country better advocate for as well as support to get more kids of color to go into teacher preparation, teacher education programs?
John, one of the things you're working with Jeff Johnson and others on that very issue.
Well, yeah. Jeff Johnson has an initiative, a 2015 initiative to increase the number of African-American teachers. I think what Randi outlined, first we've got to stop demonizing the profession and recognize it as such, a profession. A couple of months ago, a philanthropic group, we went to Singapore and Shanghai, and we were talking about how they prepare their teachers. And we asked them the question, well, what do you do with your challenge teachers? They said, we support them. We give them the support to be prepared and to be highly effective and to retain them. And, you know, bringing the U.S. influence, we say, well, what do you do with your really challenged? We said we give them more support. And they said our challenge in the U.S. is that we deal with structural changes more than we deal with supports. Meaning if someone was to say it was cold in here, they would bring in blankets. We would bring in another thermometer. And we've got to get to the point where we're actually giving the support and holding the profession for what it is, a profession. And that will actually encourage a new generation of teachers who want to go in the classroom and to help extend an opportunity to learn to all students.
One suggestion I would make for teachers union organizations, is to go sit down with the U.S. Army. What I mean by that is, I talked to a number of generals, and they said, it pains us when we are at these major sessions and people say, we want our kids to go to college, to go anywhere, because the last thing we want them to do is go into the military. And all of these black generals I was talking to, they talked about the opportunities that they all got in the military as career officers, the jobs they got when they came out of the military, and they literally have gone through a national campaign to get away from that language of the last job of resort is to go into the military. And I think in many ways, probably right above that, what do people say? Girl, look, if you can't do nothing, just go teach. And so when the language becomes, and look, I'm in the business of words. When the language becomes, this is the job of last resort, this is the job you don't want at all, I think that plays into it as well. The Army has done a very effective job in turning that corner to get people to understand that there are opportunities, not just about carrying a gun. And so I think that's also a part of it as well.
Can I tell you what we
Go right ahead.
Can I tell you what we did in our little church in Tampa last month? We had what we call Gratitude Month for the month of November. And the second Sunday of the month of November, we had Teacher Appreciation Day, Sunday, where everybody who is a teacher or was a teacher or aspires to be a teacher, we said thank you to. We had a big sign in front of our church that said, we love our teachers. I mean, you got to begin in wherever you are, however you can, to turn it around.
And I guarantee you they ain't gonna never have Journalist Appreciation Day. But whenever they get in trouble, they call me first. We gotta close this panel down. Imam, you're gonna close us out with some final thoughts and the closing prayer. Folks, give our panel a round of applause, please. I want to see that journalist.
Well, all those in favor of a good journalist day, please raise your hands. So that's my first action item of the day.
Put y'all on TV then.
Well, it seems we are all in agreement here, aren't we? Good discussion, conversation, but general agreement on most of the points. So we are essentially preaching to the choir here. And in that situation, my job is rather easy. I don't have to repeat everything because you know everything is right. And what we are complaining about, those people who listen to us are not here. So first thing I would say is that if we agree on moral values, if we are in general in agreement with most of the thoughts which are presented here, then how we take those moral principles and translate into something tangible, which is worthy of our time and our money. And for that, I think you are going to be provided excellent opportunity next 2 days. I hope some of you have noted some of the things which came out here, but there'll be tremendous amount of opportunity for us to think for the next 2 days. One of the major issues which came out in terms of moral issues is the equity issue. How our society is organized. Is it a capitalist society? And I was about to say it is not. It is more like an oligarchy at this moment. But let's leave those debate aside. But if you are for the equity, if you are the part of the 99%, even 1% part of the 99%, I would say your heart is at the right place. But the next 2 days, you need to take notes. Whenever you hear a lecture, an idea, a thought, you need to say, how can I translate that? How can I translate into systemic change? Can I take this idea and make it part of the electoral conversation in which our whole country will be engaged in the next several months? Is it just going to stay in this room or in a tea or in the good articles, brother, I read which you write, and I about say, hey, yes, and I forward it to my Facebook and here and there. But that electronic forwarding sometimes works, but we need to connect. So when you hear these system change ideas, you need to think what you can do at the individual level. As a person, to translate it as something good for your school board, for your PTA, for your union, and for the organization which many of you introduce yourself with. Second thing I would say, how that time and money going to come for us as an individuals who are struggling in terms of time and money to inject these ideas and moral principles into that electoral conversation. I hope you will find time to network with those people who specialize in this area and who will be talking to you in next 2 days. This is extraordinarily important. Whatever system we are in it. And changing that system is our responsibility. And change can happen in a big way, in a hope format, which all of us went for. But the guy said, make me do it. And somewhere we failed. And I remember President Obama's best moment to me was when he was asked during the conversation when it was still a struggle between Hillary Clinton and Senator Obama, that if Dr. King is alive today, who is he going to support between two of you? And that professor, he took his minute of thinking and said, Dr. King will not be supporting any one of us. He'll be organizing people to make sure we do what we are ought to be doing. And I would say that's where all of us who are with full of hope and energy, that's where our failure came from. We couldn't make him do it. So next 2 days when you hear lecture and ideas and meet and have photographs and whatnot, say, what is the point which you can make somebody in your neighborhood do it? Where are your points where someone you can force that, okay, that's how I'm going to influence the electoral conversation through media, through connecting with the media, because they ask the question, through your union, that they are the one who has access to some of those people you may not have access to. And through yourself, in your city, from that little guy who comes knocking to your door, through them, can he take you to the place where your questions matter? At this moment, our country is going with extraordinary difficult points. Nowhere number came that 1 in 4 children live under poverty. Am I right, Reverend, here? 1 in 4 children live under poverty. 46 million in our country, people below poverty. And those who are above poverty, we know what type of a struggle that is to stay above poverty level. That poverty level is a funny business. We are filling our prisons with people from inner cities. We have Latinos running away from school so they don't want their children to be under some type of difficulty. And just as we were busy with turkey, chasing turkey or eating turkey or struggling to make one, our Senate came up with something else. And it puts the type of, you need to realize what we face at this moment. These oligarchs came up with something that any citizen in this country could be picked up and detained indefinitely, forget the trial, without even a charge. Could you believe this? Have you heard of it? Could you raise your hand if you have heard about it? Good part of you have heard about it. This is people who are supposed to represent us. Where is the Bill of Rights? Where is our Constitution? So what I'm saying, my brothers and sisters, we are facing tremendous amount of challenges. And the people who deal with bigger challenges are 2 types of people, or both are present here in good quantity. Young people whose future is ahead of them. They want to move forward by all means. And teachers who want to teach them how to move forward. And I would also say a couple of preachers in the audience. We all 3 are involved in dealing with passion, with direction. And when the society is so conflicting between 1% and the 99%, where the differences of class, immigration, and all the oligarchy and all those issues, there are a lot of emotions. These emotions need to be mediated. Instead of emotions turning into anger and destructive direction, we need to translate them into energy. And that's where the role of teachers and preachers and young people comes in. My dear brothers and friends and sisters, let's join hands as we conclude this evening. Our burden is high. Let's pray for the strength of our teacher. Let's pray for the respect they deserve and look for. Let's pray for the greater partnership among neighbors and among teachers. O Lord, and our Creator, the source of all good, we gather here today to recommit to our future, our children. We thank you for the beautiful creation called human beings and everything else around us. You created us from one father and one mother, Eve and Adam. We seek your forgiveness for dividing up our human family with our man-made classism, tribalism, nationalism, and racism. Bless us once again with the universality preached by all your prophets. Uplift us so that we may become one, acting for the good of all and behaving as sisters and brothers. Grace us with the understanding of our shortcomings so that we may forge ahead on the path of the prophets, the path of justice, equity, and fairness. O Lord, help us to see the good and to share the good in each culture, faith, in each person and each child. Dear merciful God, open our hearts towards our neighbors and open the hearts of our neighbors towards us. Amen.
May I make an announcement, Roland? Because I'm overwhelmed with the idea, the same idea, that on a broad stroke demonizes teachers, because there's an attempt to replace organized teachers, therefore all of them have fallacies. That's the same idea that tries to suppress votes in 40 states, saying voters are too corrupt and therefore they stack the cards. That's the same idea that displaces American workers with cheap labor because we want too much for work. So if the workers want too much for work and teachers are not qualified and voters cannot be trusted, that is a consistent ideology. Leave here knowing that the attempt to demonize teachers as a frame of reference itself is immoral and corrupt, and these teachers deserve better. Thank you very much.